Supply chain sustainability in the time of the pandemic. Joining us to speak about that today, Jim Stock, professor at the University of South Florida. Jim, it's good to see you once again. Welcome.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate being here.
Jim, if anything, if a word has been important in the world of supply chain over the last number of years, it is sustainability. But let's talk about another important word, pandemic, and how this COVID situation has affected the world of sustainability. Walk us through that. What has been the effect?
Well, with the COVID-19 and all the variants that we've seen come about, and probably we'll see a few more before this is over, it's forced firms into significant changes, both tactically and strategically. And so they've reevaluated their systems. And if you want to implement a sustainability approach, it often requires significant change in the way you do business. And because of this pandemic, it has forced firms to make those changes. And this is a great time to introduce sustainability into that because you're making those substantive changes.
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, as you and I were speaking earlier, the pandemic has actually been a very needed catalyst for change. But let's talk about exactly what it has forced companies to do. Walk us through some of those changes.
Well, part of it is the consumers have changed, not just domestically in the United States, but really worldwide. We're moving from the baby boomer generation to millennials and then Gen X's, Gen Zers. Who knows what will follow them. And they're much more interested in sustainability. The research studies show that impacts who they buy from. And so companies have come to the point where they realize sustainability is a unique selling proposition if they do it correctly. And so that involves not just product development, but how they market it, how they distribute it to their supply chains, and what vendors they use and don't use, and so on.
Is it fair, or would it be fair to say that many companies would not have made these needed changes, at least not now, if they hadn't been more or less forced to by the pandemic?
Well, I think so. There's been a couple of things in recent, when we had the Great Recession, 2007 and 2009. Mm-hmm. Right prior to that, people were starting to think more about sustainability, but then that caused them to postpone that. But then the pandemic that followed several years later, which we're still in, has really forced them to look at it. And when you go to shareholder meetings, you have groups of owners, shareholders who are demanding that the company responds and that they're going to do some things like divest, and we see that through a lot of firms at hedge funds, universities, others who are not purchasing stock in companies that aren't sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, you make the argument that sustainability can actually be a profit center. Now, I'm sure a number of people would say that doesn't occur to me. I don't see that. So give us the argument. What's your rationale there? Why do you say that?
Well, you have to do it correctly. A lot of firms do things like reverse logistics, sustainability, other things, but they don't do it well. Mm-hmm. And so it's a cost center because they don't generate additional revenue or sufficient additional revenues from it. But if they do sustainability, there's a segment of people who will buy their products even at a slightly increased price. It's tough to raise your price without some value proposition that you give to a customer. And sustainability for some group of people is sufficient to justify that price increase.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But let's talk about how careful one must be entering into contractual relations with vendors. You're sourcing from this place or that place. You want to make sure that you're dealing with people who themselves are committed to sustainable operations. How do you do that? How are you able to guarantee that you're working with like-minded companies?
Well, most of the companies I work with do due diligence, at least initially with new vendors. They have surveys, they do site visits, they do a number of other things to ensure that those vendors are compliant, both in sustainability, human relationships with employees, and environmental things, a bunch of other stuff. They all have codes of conduct that they make the suppliers or vendors sign, but then it falls apart. And this is what's happened during the pandemic. You don't visit the companies as regularly as you should because it's more difficult. You do things electronically, so you take people's word. But we've seen a lot of failures on the part of vendors and suppliers who don't do what they said they were going to do. And so you've got to show your due diligence continuously, even with vendors that you're happy with, because things can change in that foreign country or even domestically with the firms.
Let's talk about the downside then. You have not been able to make the inspections that you normally would be doing because of the pandemic. What is the risk that you're running? What happens to your company in terms of its reputation, its bottom line? Walk us through what you are facing.
Well, it depends on the company. Obviously, one of the areas is palm oil preservation and deforestation and those kinds of things. And Kellogg's was being boycotted by people because they were dealing with a company that did that, even though the company doing that was a member of the Palm Oil Association that was protecting it, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But they weren't. Mm-hmm. And very little of the Kellogg's products were based upon palm oil anyway. Other companies use a lot of that. But irrespective, you've got to make sure that those vendors and suppliers are doing the same thing you would do if you were there, because customers are going to view what you do. Your vendors, suppliers are part of you and are an extension of you. They don't see them, they see you, and they'll blame you if you don't perform or if they underperform.
So it's fair to say that, assuming what you say is not merely lip service, but you really are committed to sustainability, it really is on you to ensure, to guarantee that the people that you're working with are themselves like-minded and are determined to have sustainable operations. Otherwise, you quite likely are facing some challenges that can be difficult for your reputation.
And there's a number of firms who are doing well. The Nikes of the world, they do fabulous things, and there's many other companies that are showing profitability because of the sustainability initiative, because they brought it into every aspect of their business.
So Jim, final question here. The pandemic is not likely to go away anytime soon. I mean, we're obviously in another variant right now. There may be another one that is brewing. The difficulties that people have had because of the pandemic, well, if they're there tomorrow and they're, next month, etc., what do you tell people about what you need to do going forward?
Well, I just go back to that approach that's been out for years. People profit and planet. It's much like the approaches that were done in looking at financial statements alone, but then they expanded that into looking at the HR stuff and other issues. Customers are starting to make decisions based upon a package of things, not just the financial well-being. If they're investing in stock, for example, they'll invest in people because they are friendly to the environment, or they hire minorities, or whatever. There's a laundry list of things they can do, which they view as beneficial to society as a whole and beneficial to the environment.
So you need to be attuned to that. Great advice indeed. Jim, I know you're busy here at the conference, but you found time to speak with us about this important topic. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you much.
Well, that's Jim Stock speaking with us today about sustainability and how that has been affected by the pandemic. Thank you for watching.